so to speak. So my name is Mary Austerman. I'm the coastal specialist for NYSea Grant. Sea Grant is a partnership between NOAA, the SUNY system, and Cornell. I focus on Great Lakes stuff. I'm willing to bet everyone in here, your watershed, so don't feel like this doesn't pertain to you because I work with Great Lakes.
Jayme Breschard. I'm a senior managing community planner at Barton Loguidice. Collaboratively in-house.
I met at some point. Lovely, I love it.
Let's maybe get a lay of the land in terms. Good work later on in our session, so it'll be nice to have a cross. What if planning for
trainings and try to bring a lot of the stuff that you might hear from national and state directives and try to really take that and make it digestible and applicable to local situations. And so that's what this what if is all about. So did any, I mean, don't hesitate, just throw out there, like, what does anyone think this what if is about? What if they do, right? As you're going through planning processes and just thinking about different types of scenarios that you might have to work through and how those impact the various components of your community. That's right.
planning scenario with both the ideal situation?
Because Jayme brings the planning piece. I'm not a planner. I don't play one on TV or anything. And I bring more of that climate knowledge and natural resource preservation kind of stuff to the table. So you want me to go ahead and I'll click and you can hang out over there. You seem to like it there.
Yeah, this is a good spot. Whether it be severe. In small group work. So we're going to stay and play, right?
Yes.
Do this? Okay.
There'll be a prize at the end. You could get a really fancy pizza cutter.
Along with that, with whether it can be a rising topic, whether you can believe it or not. It's happening more frequently with that we are suggesting communities embrace.
And one thing I'll add is that we've hyperlinked all of these things. So when you do, you can access these presentations through GFL. You can see these documents that Jayme's referencing.
These conversations are occurring at various levels. Obviously, we have a lot of representatives of local. Component data sets that you can use over. We're a part of that climate assessment.
The other thing I want to add is this New York Climate Change Science Clearinghouse has a ton of stuff, local level, like you can look at the county level, what we've experienced, so observations about precipitation, temperature, things like that, and then also projections looking forward under different types of low and high emission scenarios.
costs being paid through by municipal budgets. You know, hazard mitigation going for many, many years now. Integrate.
Well, and going along with weather, being in a wetter region, also think about when that's happening, you know, so we seem to getting slugs of wetness, and some of our precipitation in the winter is now rain instead of snow. So not just weather, but think about the seasonality of that too. Hold on.
Thousands of years, developed this 71%.
So the Science Clearinghouse website, it does go into some of the particulars about the data that's being used to drive some of these things, which this data is not from that, it's from a national one. But it's when we've got the record taking, that's when records were starting to be recorded.
Most of it's opinion.
I hear you. It's the best that we've got.
Years with the federal emergency management agency. And heat. Gals, and we're here really talking more locally.
Oftentimes happening simultaneously.
Right. There's kind of long-term types of decisions for our communities. Talk. What if planning is a good tool to utilize? Is this where you
Nope. No, this is where we both go.
Okay, all right. sorry.
So Jamie's already talked quite a bit about what if planning, and she's actually accidentally thrown the word scenario in there. So if you've heard of scenario planning, this is the same thing. It's thinking through different types of scenarios that could happen and what kinds of things does your community need to do to be prepared for those. And not just prepared, but better able to respond, right? Because things happen and you're not going to be bulletproof. But the idea is that when things happen, your community may not need to rely on outside assistance, and you guys have the ability to respond on your own independently. Want to start with this one, Jayme?
So again, financial, social, thinking about populations, and like
So one of the things that's helpful to do before you go through a what if process is really identify the assets that are important to your community. So this goes back to the, again, not the planner, but as Jayme mentioned, when you go through some kind of visioning, that's the first thing that Jayme tells me is important to do. Identify what the assets of importance are. And that's where you start really thinking through what do we need to do to protect those.
and with resiliency plan. So okay, so what we're going to do today is and exploratory. So watershed. You know, how do you work? In New York State, I think is a challenge. I just like a lot of kind of obstacles to doing that. One scenario with a hazard, and then you add another hazard on top of it. Let's say you have an extreme storm like Superstorm Sandy that comes through and brings a lot of damage to the community. And then you add a hazard at the same time. That's what contingency planning is. To utilize in these processes. Yep. In just a moment, but again, important when we talk about resiliency planning, based on social, economic, legal, and regional considerations. So think about your tax base, think about the populations that are benefiting or maybe not benefiting from the protected. Social, what are those competing interests? And this will be really very helpful. And it's a really good why. This is what it's going to, again, the poking the holes are kind of coming at it from different directions. Hopefully it helps to kind
Okay, so building the scenario. And so for this, what we have thought is thinking about different types of disturbances. So we can think about weather disturbances and how those things are impacting these assets within your community. And so for this exercise that I'll be describing, you don't need to all agree on a community. You can just share thoughts about your own community as you guys work through the exercise. So don't worry about, we're not all from the same place. And then as you think through these assets, then thinking through like what kinds and understanding how they're impacted, what kinds of things can we do to make them better prepared or more resilient? So we have this process that we've been using, and this is something like if you look up scenario planning, you can find there's a million ways to do it. There's no wrong or right way. Any way that makes you think through what you've got happening, what you can be doing, things that will happen that will mess up your plan or obstacles, and then ways to overcome those obstacles or barriers. Scenario planning or what if planning. It's always just start somewhere and help you think through this process. You need to keep going back and revisiting. One of the things that you won't see through the slide, but you will see on your handout is this who benefits. So an example from my region, Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, 2017, Lake Ontario. Now that is 8 counties with a ton of municipalities, but it's a coastal ribbon of those municipalities. Those are the people that were directly impacted by the flooding. But then the argument is, well, what about the other part of the community? Because now we've got resources and time and effort and money and everything being focused on just a very small percentage in some cases of the population. And then on the flip, these are all conversations. On the flip side, a lot of those homes make up a large portion of the tax base. So this is a very complicated decision. So when we think about who benefits, it's also important. So in that case, maybe the direct benefits may not in category to be thinking about are underserved communities or maybe vulnerable populations within a community. So it's important to be considering those as you think through this process. So the first step that you're going to do, first step is you're going to receive a paper. And so this grid or this matrix outlines this whole thing for you. The first thing you do is identify the climate stressor, but for you guys, we did that for you. So it's either drought, flooding, or extreme storms because we forgot to change that on the slide. Identify the potential impacts. Oh, sorry. You first then think through these core recovery functions. So that box to the left, those are the FEMA core recovery functions. So for each of those, you think through the impacts. So for this one, we chose housing to kind of walk you through it. So for housing, loss of damage or damage of property, loss of life, and human displacement, people have to leave.
So climate stressor is flooding. Flooding on housing and loss of life, human displacement, obviously.
So then we talk about strategies. So what could we do to mitigate this in the future, right? So we could elevate structures. This is happening. This picture is actually, so when we think about elevating, a lot of us probably think houses on stilts, right? This is actually elevation. And building their foundations higher. And then another option is to relocate. So are you in an area where relocating homes makes sense and is possible? And there are, I was just gonna say, there's a number of options that could be used for something like this. It's just 2
strategies of flooding impact housing.
And And then the fourth step is, what are some of these barriers or obstacles? So what can stop you from implementing the strategy that you've identified? A lot of times it's going to be funding, right? Community buy-in. It may not be a popular idea. I can tell you, using Soda's Point as an example, relocation of homes is not popular. And also the question then is also where, because there's not a lot of space. And then also political support. Again, these are just 3 examples. Then we start thinking about, well, how can we overcome those examples? Jayme mentioned this before, intermunicipal collaboration. With flooding, this is huge. Water does not know that we're stopping at one county or one municipality and going into the next. And water always wins. So if you take nothing else from today, take those 2 points with you. Grants. There are grants out there that can help. Legislation. So do we need to think about policy change, public outreach campaigns, technical assistance, new programs and policies? So this here, I just did a quick search about flood campaign, and this came up. It's actually pretty cool. They have like pre-made social media blasts that you can take and customize for your community. So that would be a way to get buy-in. And then go back and think through a second of these core recovery functions. So we chose housing, but then if we do that, what does that mean to other areas within the community? So if you're going to elevate a home by 8 feet, the question here is health and social. And you might be thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, if you now need a ladder truck and your fire department doesn't have that, then that's a huge concern. So that's a question and something that the community would have to think through. And also viewscape is another big one. Yeah.
Unintended consequences. So you try to one sector, which is the housing, that's getting the impacts of the is very high, along like not particularly ground, and now these ladder trucks cannot get to. And then again, thinking more about how certain segments of the population now.
Okay, so yeah.
To
Okay, everybody, you guys can kind of wrap up. And as little or as much time on it as you'd like. Just some reactions about, what that looked like and how that might have impacted another one of their core recovery functions. Any volunteers, please? But then
Well, I'll just talk about housing.
okay.
We all agreed that the impacts of flooding on housing were loss, damage to property, and displacement of people when their homes are damaged and destroyed. Mitigation strategies, we talked about those: elevation or relocation. The obstacle is cost. All of that costs a lot of money, and the solutions are public subsidies for reduced vulnerability. And who benefits? Those who receive the funding for mitigation. And who doesn't benefit? Those who don't get that funding. If they don't apply, and then there are those people who might not want to move, so they don't benefit either, even if they are getting what some would say was a benefit, they're not necessarily benefiting. And natural and cultural resources, we filled in a mitigation strategy would be to preserve natural systems of wetlands and floodplains. Preserve existing systems to
like any similarity. Where I was, yeah, you were flooded.
Very good, but they had hit across all of it.
But it's also going to benefit these other things. rates. Or maybe find a partner that maybe you look. Want to share anything?
Self-sufficient.
What that network might look like for you, because very specific stuff. Those smaller. Make a decision. I'd be. Okay. I had a full tank of gas and probably a couple If people want extra copies, and if you also want an electronic version of it, email me.